I'm Linda, 65 years old. I work part-time at a boutique. My husband, George, is 70 and became a contract worker after his retirement. Our son, Chris, is 37 and single. After graduating from a university in another state, he returned to the town to work. He had a place of his own. So it was just my husband and me at home. Chris would often contact and visit me, but he tried to avoid his father. I wouldn't blame him. Considering his father had been abusive and had exhibited behaviors that would now be classified as psychological and domestic violence. There had been countless conflicts between my husband and me, but when Chris was very little, I was always by his side. So he was spared from being directly harmed. Of course, it must have been terrifying for him to see his mother being verbally abused and having things thrown at her. The first time Chris was verbally abused by his father was when he was in kindergarten. That day, we were expecting all my in-laws to visit us, so I was busy preparing food. My husband, who had never helped with housework or childcare, didn't lift a finger even when his guests were coming. But unusually, he said he'd take Chris to the park since he was free until the guests arrived. Apparently, Chris asked his father to take him to the park. I was a bit worried, but I was too busy to go with them, so I let my husband take him. The park was close to our house and in the neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, so I thought even my husband wouldn't cause trouble there. However, within half an hour after they left, Chris returned home alone, crying. I knew something was wrong before the doorbell rang because of his cry. Are you okay? Did you get hurt? Dad. He was crying so hard he couldn't speak. I rubbed his back and soothed him. He wasn't injured, which was a relief. My husband still hadn't returned, and I wondered where he was. Once Chris calmed down, he explained to me what happened. That was when I heard a loud bang and my husband came home. He never cared about disturbing the neighbors, no matter how many times I told him to be quiet. Although he rarely resorted to physical violence, his verbal abuse was severe, and he'd often take his anger out on inanimate objects. The reasons for his outbursts were always trivial, and it was no different on that day. Chris, who loved the swing, was first pushed by his father. But my husband soon grew bored and wanted to sit on a bench. Then, Chris' shoe came off while swinging, accidentally hitting my husband's shoulder. That made his favorite shirt dirty. First, I thought Chris might have continued playing without noticing or apologizing, but that wasn't the case. I did say sorry, but he yelled at me, over and over. Left alone at the park, he had to come home all by himself, crying. Furious, I stormed into the study, where my husband would often shut himself away. What were you thinking, leaving a small child alone in the park? What if something happened to him? Idiot. You can see the house from the park. What do you think could happen? I confronted him about not forgiving Chris and continuing to yell at him, even though he apologized, but my husband wouldn't listen to me. He insulted me and Chris, and also criticized my parenting skills. A pathetic excuse of a son, a bad mother, and so on. As I glared at him, he yelled, "What's with that look?" and started throwing anything he could get his hands on at me. Stationery scattered on the floor, his coffee cup shattered against the wall. I retaliated, throwing back whatever came my way. Running out of small objects, my husband finally stopped throwing things at me. The last thing he threw at me was his dirty shirt. Wash this now. Make sure to get mud out of it. Now get out. I left the study without a word. Who was the idiot here? I thought it was just absurd to wear something, which you didn't want to get dirty, to a park with a child. It should have been easy to imagine that, even for someone who didn't play with their child regularly. Getting angry and shifting blame for his own mistake. When I came out of the study, Chris was there, shrinking and trembling with fear, watching the situation. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine, honey. Sorry we scared you. You're bleeding. I tried to avoid getting hurt, but I had some cuts and bruises. I must have touched pieces of the broken cup. Before, I was the only target, but from then on, my husband started targeting Chris as well. He's never said anything, but I think the emotional scars from his childhood is still troubling him. As a mother, I feel terrible about it, but the fact that he grew up to be a kind person is my only consolation. To be honest, I was afraid that something awful might happen due to the conflicts between him and my husband, as he entered adolescence. Every time I heard distressing news on TV, I feared it wasn't just someone else's problem. Fortunately, unlike his father, Chris was thoughtful, so we were able to avoid the worst-case scenario. As he grew older, he subtly shielded me from his father's attacks and even intervened to calm him down, which helped to reduce the frequency of the attacks. Perhaps my husband realized he was no match for Chris physically. Once I found a part-time job at a boutique and began working on weekends and public holidays, I wasn't subjected to his physical outbursts as much, though I was still getting verbally abused by him. When Chris went to college in another state, and also when he chose to come back to work locally but not to live with us, I encouraged him, seeing his hesitation. "I'll be okay. I don't think your father will physically hurt me. But still. You know I always fight back, right? So, I'll be fine. You go on and follow the path you choose. No matter what choice you make, I'll be here for you." Though I reassured him, as expected, my husband's attacks intensified once it was just the two of us. To defend myself, I retaliated when yelled at unjustly, and threw back when things were thrown at me. I wasn't going to be defeated. One day, while watching TV casually, a feature on abusive husbands caught my attention. I was struck by a sudden realization. The description of an abusive husband matched my own husband, persistently attacking my character, and always getting angry at me over trivial matters. That was exactly what my husband was like. I learned that verbal and physical abuse often go hand in hand, including intimidation through loud voices or actions, and throwing objects, and withholding money and controlling the household spending. Things had changed. In the past, unless there was direct physical attack, it wasn't recognized as violence, and many suffered in silence even when abused. It also made sense to me that many abusers acted differently in public. My husband had always been exceptionally good at presenting himself to others. I doubt his colleagues knew he was an abusive person. Some neighbors might have suspected something was going on because of his yelling, but I was sure he would just tell them that it was nothing important. And his severe attacks were directed only at me and Chris, fooling everyone else. From that day, I began to prepare for divorce. First, saving money. For the past few years, I stopped spending my part-time earnings on living expenses and started saving. So, I had enough to start a new life on my own. Fortunately, my husband wasn't aware. I anticipated he wouldn't agree to a fair division of property. That was why I needed to save as much as possible just in case. Next, since he probably wouldn't agree to a divorce, I needed to gather objective evidence for the grounds for divorce. If he refused to get divorced, it would go to mediation, and if that failed, to court, so evidence was crucial. I was determined to work hard for a favorable and quick divorce. Chris was also encouraging my independence. I told him what made me decide to divorce. I heard on the grapevine that an old friend got a late-life divorce. She moved to a big city when she was young, married a wealthy man, raised the children, and even had grandchildren. Everyone envied what seemed like a picture-perfect life. But another old friend from back home shared the truth with me. Her words pierced my heart. For years, she endured her husband's infidelity and emotional abuse. Wow. You never know what someone is going through, even if they seem happy. It surprised me, not because she got divorced, but because her situation was exactly the same as mine. Just like my husband, her husband cheated on her. And not long ago, I discovered my husband's affair. Boldly, he'd been seeing a woman who lived near our home. She was a widow, living alone. I saw my husband enter her house on my way back from work. It was like something out of a TV drama. Both my husband and his mistress came out of the house shortly after, so I quickly had to hide. Luckily, they didn't come my way and went to a nearby convenience store. I didn't know what else to do. But I texted Chris, who replied immediately. Get a few photos of Dad going in and out of the house. Don't forget to mute the camera shutter on your phone, or you can just take a video. Okay. It was early in the evening, so it was already getting darker in the countryside, as there were a few houses around. It wasn't hard to hide myself, but I had to be careful not to be seen with the bright screen of my phone. They were absorbed in their own world, making it easy for me to take photos. They came out of the convenience store with a shopping bag, walked back, and entered her house. The light in a room on the ground floor turned on. I was guessing it was probably the living room. In less than half an hour, the light downstairs went off and an upstairs window lit up. After a while, that too went dark. About an hour and a half after I first spotted my husband, he left her house. I took another photo of him coming out of the house and hurried home. They seemed reluctant to part. Later, I consulted with Chris and decided to hire a lawyer. Following the lawyer's advice, I gathered evidence of infidelity and emotional abuse, including photos, videos, and audio recordings. I also started packing my belongings so I could leave the house at any moment. Finally, the day came to confront my husband about the divorce. I hardly slept the night before, but I wasn't tired. Chris, concerned, asked me to talk with my husband on the weekend when he was off work, so he could wait for me in his car outside our house. After texting my son, I brought up the subject with my husband. I need to talk to you. What is it? I want a divorce. A divorce. Don't be ridiculous. I won't agree to it. What complaints could you possibly have? It was that loud voice of his I couldn't stand. Unfazed, I continued with what needed to be said. About the emotional and physical abuse, infidelity, and that I had evidence. That I was ready to leave immediately, and that I wanted him to discuss further matters with my lawyer. Hearing this, my husband became infuriated. Your lawyer? Why would you involve someone else in the family matters? He couldn't stand the idea of outsiders getting involved in our family issues. He continued to intimidate and destroy things while yelling at me. Seemingly frustrated by my calm demeanor, he persistently threw objects at me. Ouch. Suddenly, a loud noise and my husband's scream echoed. An item he threw hit the fishing rod which I cleaned the day before, causing it to fall to the floor. As he stepped on it, the rod broke. Then he slipped, falling onto his backside. I was taken aback. What are you doing? You idiot. Don't just stand there, call an ambulance. I considered leaving him right then, but upon closer observation, it seemed he genuinely hurt himself and couldn't stand up. After a moment's thought, I called an ambulance and informed Chris. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived and took my husband away. The paramedics told me, who showed no intention of leaving the house. Ma'am, you should accompany him in the ambulance. They must have mistaken my stillness for confusion. No, please go ahead without me. What? I won't be going with him. We're getting a divorce, so it's no longer my concern. My husband was taken to the hospital alone in the ambulance. He had fractured his tailbone and cracked his pelvis. He called me many times, demanding various things be brought to him. Out of a final act of kindness, I delivered plenty of clothes and personal items. I ignored further calls, but then had a good idea and went to the hospital when his clean clothes were likely to run out. Interrupting his tirade of insults, as he lay immobile, I made an offer. I'll do your laundry. In return, I want you to proceed with the divorce discussions with my lawyer. He just glared at me, saying nothing. If you don't like it, I'll leave. Fine. While my husband was hospitalized, I rented an apartment and moved out. I spoke with my lawyer, and as expected, my husband and I can't agree about the money. However, he seems to have understood my resolve and is willing to proceed with the divorce. Chris and I keep in touch, occasionally going out for shopping or meals, and he's surprised to see the changes in me. I've never seen you look so happy before, Mom. Maybe you're right. I'm truly enjoying myself now. There are so many things I want to do. I can go out with friends without worry. And I can display my favorite ceramics and glass ornaments without fear of them being broken. Freedom is wonderful.